February 1258. A middle-aged man walks slowly through rooms he once thought would outlast him. Gold gleams on every side. Coins, plates, ingots, bolts of silk stacked like bricks. It's his treasury, his life's work. 50 years of hoarded wealth, tribute and taxes. The guards escorting him aren't his. Outside, Baghdad is in flames. Smoke crawls across the winter sky. The roar of a dying city presses in through the walls. Inside this vault, it's quiet enough to hear the shuffle of boots, the soft clink of metal. The man is al-Musta, Abbasid caliph, commander of the faithful, nominal ruler of an Islamic world that stretches from the edges of India to the shores of the Atlantic. In theory, he's the political and spiritual heir of the Prophet's community. In practice, he is a prisoner in his own capital. The soldiers watching him are looking for one thing: does he finally understand? There's no speech, no shouted accusations, just the question hanging in the air. Why is all of this still here? Why is this gold stacked in vaults while the city's walls crumble? Why did this silk buy comfort instead of armor? Why did these coins sit untouched while an enemy perfected the art of destruction? In 3 hours, the last Abbasid caliph of Baghdad will be dead, but not by sword, not by lance, not by an execution that leaves a heroic wound. His killers follow laws you've probably never heard of. Their etiquette of blood shapes his final moments. What they do to him and his family is more than punishment. It's a design, a diagram etched into memory so that every ruler from Damascus to Delhi understands exactly what happens when you misread the balance of power. They don't need to repeat this lesson often. Once is enough. For half a millennium, Baghdad was not just a capital. It was the gravitational center of a civilization. This is the city where Greek philosophy was translated and debated in Arabic, where Persian techniques in astronomy and medicine were refined, where Indian numerals and mathematical methods were woven into a new intellectual fabric. Knowledge didn't just pass through Baghdad, it pooled there. The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was more than a library. It was a research institute, a translation bureau, a place where people argued over the nature of reality, and then went outside and built things based on their conclusions. Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm, developed algebra here. Al-Razi wrote medical treatises in these streets that Latin Europe would still be mining 4 centuries later. Scholars came from Al-Andalus, from North Africa, from Central Asia, simply to sit in on lectures. By medieval standards, Baghdad was enormous, its population likely over 1 million. Water flowed through underground conduits and canals. Markets carried goods from China, Central Asia, East Africa, and the Mediterranean. Its hospitals treated patients regardless of religion or status. Its courts adjudicated disputes that spanned continents. This was not an empire in senile decline like late Rome. Baghdad was still functioning, still producing, still thinking. The machinery of urban life was intact. Above this whole structure sat the Abbasid caliph. He was not merely another king. His office fused religious symbolism with political leadership. His legitimacy, at least in theory, traced back through generations to the family of the Prophet. When al-Musta took the throne in 1242, he inherited that aura. But beneath the surface, something else had been handed to him, a state that had been hollowing out for 200 years. On paper, the Abbasid Caliphate still commanded respect. In reality, its core territories had shrunk to Iraq and parts of western Iran. The caliph's armies were dominated by mercenaries of uncertain loyalty. Provincial governors behaved like independent rulers. Vassal emirs paid lip service to Baghdad but raised their own troops and struck their own bargains. The treasury still filled with taxes, gifts, and endowments, but its gold rarely went into fortifications or long-term military reforms. Why should it? Baghdad had survived civil wars, palace coups, and foreign invasions. The city had seen rival caliphs rise and fall. It had watched neighboring empires implode and vanish while Baghdad's lamps kept burning and its scholars kept writing. So when rumors drifted in from the east, about riders who had erased kingdoms, about cities that had ceased to exist, Baghdad listened, nodded, and carried on. The mistake was thinking this was just one more wave of raids. Those horsemen from the east were not a horde in the loose, shapeless sense of the word. They were a system. In 1227, when Genghis Khan died, he left behind something the world had never seen, not just a swath of conquered land, but a reproducible method of war. A doctrine tested again and again from the frozen forests of the north to the deserts of Central Asia. His descendants inherited both territory and technique. One of them, Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, was given a specific mission by the Mongol Imperial Assembly in 1253, move west and bring every power from Iran to the Mediterranean into obedience. The objective was not permanent occupation of every province. The objective was submission. The Mongol Empire wasn't built on planting garrisons in every town. It was built on making sure those towns never again thought rebellion was a rational option. Their terms were always the same. First, envoys appeared, sometimes just a handful of riders with a written message: acknowledge the sovereignty of the great Khan, send tribute, wealth, craftsmen, hostages, usually royal sons, take down your fortifications, allow Mongol agents to oversee your foreign policy, accept, and your ruler stays on his throne as a subordinate. Your people keep their homes, your markets stay open, the empire profits from your taxes and your trade. Refuse, and nothing happens immediately. No furious threats, no theatrical countdown to war. Just a return to silence. Days pass, then weeks. The routines of the city resume. Some of your advisors start to say the danger was exaggerated. Others insist the Mongols are busy elsewhere. And then, one morning, the skyline darkens with dust. Cavalry appears in ordered ranks. Not a mass of riders milling around, but neat lines wheeling and redeploying. Behind them roll the heavy wagons and the crews of engineers. The army doesn't charge. It unfolds. Detachments ride out to close every road, every gate, every path to the river. Scouts seal off orchards and gardens where fugitives might slip away. Camps go up in rings around the city. Supply depots are organized. Guard rotations fixed. Soon the defenders see something that chills them more than the sight of horsemen: construction. Under the direction of Chinese and Persian engineers, the Mongols begin building siege engines, stone-throwing trebuchets that can hurl projectiles heavy enough to smash masonry. They assemble them in full view of the walls. A second set of envoys arrives with the same offer as before. Word for word. This is the last time it will be extended. At this point, most cities submit. Their rulers have seen too many others turned into graveyards. But when a city continues to resist, the process that follows is not a riot. It's a sequence. The bombardment targets specific points. The infantry advances in format. Ion through breaches, methodically securing one quarter after another. The population is sorted. Craftsmen, scholars and specialists are picked out and spared, then moved into Mongol lands. The rest are driven outside the walls. Mass killing follows, not as a sack gone mad, but as an operation. The city is burned or razed. Its name becomes a warning label in the stories of refugees. By the time Hulagu turned his attention to Iraq, he had repeated this pattern in Khorasan and Persia. Nishapur resisted. Its people were wiped out. Merv resisted. It was systematically emptied. Herat resisted. It was turned into ruins. Entire urban networks disappeared, and with them the memory of alternative futures. Survivors carried a single message westward: refusing the Mongols wasn't courageous, it was suicidal. Now the largest, most storied city between Iran and Egypt stood next in line. Baghdad. September 1257. 3 Mongol envoys arrived at the Abbasid court with a letter. Its content was predictable for anyone who'd been paying attention. You've heard what's happened to the cities of Persia. You know what refusal costs. Present yourself at our camp. Accept Mongol overlordship. Dismantle your defenses. Send your sons as hostages. Pay tribute. Do this and Baghdad will be spared. The letter reached al-Mustasim's palace on a Thursday. By Friday the argument had begun. In one camp stood the vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, a cautious, pragmatic man who could count. He laid out the facts. The Khwarezmian Empire had raised colossal armies. It had fortified towns and mountain redoubts. It no longer existed. Cities with defenses thicker and stronger than Baghdad's had been emptied of inhabitants. The Mongols were not a seasonal threat to be waited out. They were a war machine honed by continuous campaign. We cannot beat them in the field. We cannot outlast them in a siege, he argued. Our only hope is to avoid the test altogether. Submit, pay what they ask, keep the city alive. Opposing him stood the head of Baghdad's armed forces and the faction around him. To them, the Mongols were primarily horse archers of the steppe, brutal in the open but allegedly poor at serious siegecraft. Baghdad had thick walls and a moat. The Tigris defended one side. They were convinced that nomads so far from their pastures and base of supplies could not maintain a protracted siege of such a large city. From their viewpoint, surrendering without even trying to fight would be an unforgivable humiliation. A third group framed the issue in theological terms. Baghdad was the seat of the Caliphate, the symbolic heart of Islam. Could God really allow idol-worshipping or shamanist invaders to erase the place where the Prophet's successor ruled and where the Friday sermon invoked his name? Faith, they insisted, was a fortress no siege engine could break. Al-Musta listened. By temperament, he was not a war leader. Contemporary accounts describe him as personally pious, fond of comfort, enamored with the trappings of status, relying heavily on courtiers. He had never commanded a grand campaign. He held the letter from Hulagu. He weighed the prestige of the Caliphate against the fear in his vizier's voice. Then he chose pride. "We are the house of Abbas," he reputedly said. "We do not bow to threats carried by horsemen." He ordered the envoys dismissed without a written answer. No tribute would be sent. No sons would be given as hostages. What he did next was even more telling than what he said. He did not throw the treasury open to raise emergency forces. He did not overhaul the city's defenses. He did not call for allies beyond vague appeals. He went back to routine. The Mongols did not, by November 1257, advance elements of Hulagu's army appear. East of Baghdad, perhaps 5,000 cavalry. They lacked visible siege equipment. To the caliph's generals, this looked like an opportunity. If this was merely a forward detachment, Baghdad could march out, smash it, and show everyone the Mongols could be beaten. That, they thought, might deter a larger invasion. On November 13th, roughly 20,000 men, about 12,000 cavalry and 8,000 infantry, left Baghdad. This was the largest army the Caliphate had assembled in years. They carried a few days' worth of supplies. They expected a swift engagement and a triumphant return. 2 days later, northeast of the city, they found the enemy. What they saw seemed to confirm their hopes. A Mongol force smaller than their own, maybe 4,000 riders, drawn up in front of them. The Baghdad cavalry charged. The Mongol front line began to withdraw, orderly, steady, not breaking, just giving ground. Baghdad's horsemen pressed harder. They had the momentum, they thought. The enemy was already wavering. Then the trap closed. From gullies and low hills on both flanks, fresh Mongol units emerged. These were the troops the Baghdad commanders had not seen. Suddenly, the caliph's cavalry was being hit from the sides and rear by mounted archers. The horsemen of Baghdad tried to regain formation. Orders were shouted, lost in noise and confusion. Arrows fell in deadly arcs. Mongol composite bows, powerful and accurate from the saddle, punched through armor from distances many Baghdad riders hadn't trained for. Infantry, watching from behind, saw their own cavalry swallowed in a swirl of dust and steel. They began drifting backward toward Baghdad. The Mongols did not chase the fleeing foot soldiers in a wild pursuit. They tightened the ring around the trapped cavalry and destroyed it deliberately. By nightfall, the caliph's field army barely existed. Of the 20,000 who'd marched out, only a few thousand stragglers made it back. Much of the professional cavalry, especially the mercenary corps on which the Caliphate relied, was gone. Baghdad no longer had a viable army outside its walls. When that reality reached the palace, fear broke through denial. Whatever was coming was not a border skirmish, it was the full machinery of Mongol siege warfare. January 1258. Hulagu's main force arrived and spread around Baghdad like a tightening noose. Estimates vary, but many historians put his army at well over 100,000 men, including large contingents of siege specialists and allied levies. They didn't just surround the city, they built an ecosystem around it. Fortified camps went up facing each gate. Archers watched every stretch of wall. Lines of communication ran back to supply bases in Persia. Boats and makeshift bridges secured control of the Tigris crossings. Scouts intercepted anyone attempting to flee. Then the carpenters and engineers got to work. Chinese artisans supervised the assembly of massive counterweight trebuchets. Timber frames rose. Ropes were knotted and tested. Sling arms were calibrated. All of this took place within sight of Baghdad's defenders, who could watch the instruments of their fate taking shape day after day. Once the siege lines were complete, Hulagu sent one more message. This time the terms were narrower, the era of painless submission had passed. The caliph could still save his life, perhaps, He might even be given some form of vassal status, but the city would pay dearly regardless. Open the gates. Lay down your arms. Present yourself in my camp within 3 days. Inside Baghdad, what remained of the court gathered again. The vizier pressed for acceptance. There was no army left to sally forth. No powerful Muslim monarch was marching to the rescue. The city's food stores and more ale could not withstand a long bombardment. The religious optimists remained convinced that divine intervention would arrive, or that the status of the Caliphate itself made total destruction unthinkable. Al-Mustasim hesitated. Then he did what he had done before when faced with a terrible choice. Nothing. 3 days passed without any envoy riding out. The walls stayed closed. The Mongols began Phase 2. On January 29th, just before dawn, the catapults opened fire. They did not lob stones randomly for show. For nearly 2 weeks, Mongol engineers had observed the walls, studied the angles, the construction, the points where repairs and patches were visible. Now they targeted those weak spots. Boulders smashed into the same stretches again and again. Each impact cracked mortar, shifted blocks, propagated invisible fractures. Dust plumes rose over the battlements. Guards were forced back from parapets under showers of falling debris. After 8 hours, the bombardment stopped. The besiegers did not rush forward. They let physics and time do their work, as already damaged masonry continued to settle and weaken overnight. 2 days later, on February 1st, the trebuchets resumed. The focus was as precise as before. Chunks of the wall visibly buckled, cracks spread. In some sectors, defenders found themselves staring at vertical seams widening before their eyes. On February 5th, a large section of the eastern wall gave way, a gap reportedly some 30 meters wide. The Mongols advanced toward the breach not like a mob but like infantry on exercise. Units moved forward in an organized line, securing the rubble, forming defensive arcs of their own, then pushing street by street. Baghdad's remaining soldiers and volunteers fought, but they were fractured, exhausted, and unfamiliar with this kind of disciplined assault. By night, much of the eastern quarter lay in Mongol hand. Resistance continued for several more days, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. On February 10th, Al-Mustasim finally did what Hulagu had asked him to do months before. He sent word that he would surrender in person and order his garrison to lay down arms if the city was spared. Hulagu replied quickly, "Come to my camp unarmed on the appointed day." February 13th, 1258. The gates of Baghdad swung open. The caliph did not go alone. Around 3,000 members of his court walked with him, his sons, high officials, military commanders, judges, scholars. Many of them believed they would negotiate terms and be reinstalled as Mongol-approved administrators. Mongol soldiers lined the path, watching in near silence. No taunts, no celebratory jeering, just a hard, unreadable attention. In Hulagu's tent, the formalities were short. The Khan's first question went straight to the point. "Where is your wealth?" Al-Mustasim tried a formula about paying tribute. Hulagu insisted on specifics. The caliph gave directions to the main treasury. Scouts went. They found it as described. Rooms full of coin, bullion, precious textiles, jewelry, the condensed labor of generations. Hulagu had the caliph brought there. So the ruler of Baghdad walked once more through chambers he had assumed he would bequeath to his sons. But now he did so as a captive, flanked by foreign soldiers, while outside, ash from burning neighborhoods drifted on the wind. Chests were opened, ledgers inspected. The sheer volume of untouched wealth was obvious. The chronicler Rashid al-Din, writing later under Mongol patronage in Persia, preserves an anecdote in which Hulagu mocks the caliph. "If this gold could not save your city when it was stacked safely in your vaults, of what use is it now?" One version even claims Hulagu ordered the caliph to eat pieces of his treasure, a symbolic gesture of bitter irony. Whether or not it occurred literally, however embellished the details, the underlying message was clear. This hoard represented choices not made, walls not strengthened, men not paid, alliances not secured. Now it became part of the plunder. The Mongols were shamanists with a complex web of taboos. One of the strictest was about royal blood. It was not to be spilled on the ground. Killing nobles and rulers had to be done in ways that did not let their blood soak into the earth, lest it anger the spirits and unbalance the cosmos. So for Al-Mustasim, they chose a method consistent with their beliefs and terrifying in its coldness. He was bound, some say sewn, inside a thick carpet or rug, completely enclosed, arms pinned, legs immobilized. Then he was laid down. Horses were led over the bundle, not in a wild gallop, but in controlled passes. Hooves rose and fell, crushing ribs, organs, and bones. There was no outward gore, no executioner's blade. When the trampling ceased, the last Abbasid caliph of Baghdad was dead, his blood contained. The choice of method wasn't just about spiritual hygiene, it was about creating an image that would travel. The mightiest Muslim ruler on earth suffocated and smashed under the weight of warhorses, his body wrapped like a discarded carpet. His sons did not escape. Contemporary sources agree they were executed quickly, though the manner varies in the telling. Some accounts suggest they met a fate similar to their fathers, others that they were killed more straightforwardly. What is consistent is that none survived. With them, any realistic hope of reviving Abbasid authority in Baghdad vanished. A dynasty that had claimed nearly 5 centuries of continuous succession in the city was cut off in an afternoon. The caliph's daughters and female relatives vanish more quietly from the record. Some later histories say they were distributed among Mongol commanders or taken east. The chronicles are deliberately vague, the implication is grim. As for the other men who had walked out with al-Musta, they were sorted: engineers, physicians, scribes, artisans with rare skills. They were identified and pulled aside for redeployment into the Mongol administration and army. The rest, from minor officials to scholars with no immediately useful expertise, were marched out and killed. The Caliphate, at least as Baghdad had known it, ended not with a contested succession, but with a mass execution. What followed inside the city lasted about 2 weeks, and it burned itself into the memory of the region. Hulagu effectively turned Baghdad over to his troops under controlled conditions. The army divided the city into sectors. Each contingent knew which streets and neighborhoods it was responsible for. This was not free-for-all looting, it was organized harvesting and extermination. First, valuables. Gold and silver were collected, weighed, and recorded. Silks, carpets, spices, fine ceramics, anything that could travel and be sold, was hauled out. Private libraries were stripped for manuscripts. Religious buildings were not immune if they contained wealth. Alongside this, specialists were still being pulled from the crowd: metalworkers, stonemasons, carpenters, money handlers. People whose skills could feed the Mongol war machine were worth more alive than dead. Then the rest. Common estimates from medieval observers range up to 1 million dead, numbers modern historians treat skeptically. Contemporary demography makes it likely that tens of thousands to perhaps 200,000 people perished directly or as a result of the sack. The exact figure matters less than the scale of the rupture. Entire quarters were depopulated, cemeteries filled in days. Mass graves swallowed people whose names no Chr. Chronicle recorded. The physical city suffered in ways that went beyond immediate looting. The House of Wisdom, already weakened by previous political turmoil, was destroyed. Shelves of books, many of them unique translations or commentaries, were hurled into the Tigris or burned. Later writers described the river running dark with dissolved ink and choked with pages. That image is probably poetic exaggeration, but it captures something very real: the erasure of an accumulated archive. Mosques, palaces, and civic buildings were damaged or razed. The Caliphal Palace complex was heavily dismantled. Crucial parts of the canal and irrigation system around Baghdad were deliberately broken. That decision ensured that agriculture and urban life would struggle for years to regain their former complexity. By February 20th, Hulagu judged his work done. His army pulled back, leaving behind a city that technically still existed, but as a ghost of its former self. Survivors crept back. Markets would eventually reopen on a reduced scale. But the Baghdad that had once been the beating heart of an intellectual and commercial world was gone. What remained, besides ruins and refugees, was the story. News of what had happened in Baghdad traveled at the speed of fear. Caravans, diplomats, fleeing scholars, and merchants carried the tale west and south. In Damascus, in Aleppo, in the courts of minor emirs in Syria and Anatolia, advisors and rulers listened to the details. The caliph had refused demands for submission. His field army had been annihilated in a single engineered battle. The city's walls had crumbled under precision bombardment. The ruler himself had been executed in a way designed to shock and humiliate. His sons were dead, his lineage snuffed out. His capital, once thought inviolable, lay half empty and scorched. This was not just another conquered city, it was Baghdad. This could happen there. Where was safe? Rulers began running a brutally simple calculation. Option 1, resist. Bet everything on fortifications and religious prestige. Risk seeing your capital starved, battered, its population butchered. Risk your own death in a fashion that would be retold with relish by your enemies. Option 2, submit before the army even appears on the horizon. Send envoys with tribute and hostages. Accept a Mongol officer looking over your shoulder. Keep your throne as a subordinate ruler. Live. The equation did not really look like a choice. In the years immediately following 1258, many cities and principalities that had once talked about holy war against the Mongols quietly shifted course. Some opened their gates the moment Mongol envoys appeared. Others sent word to Hulagu's court proactively, hoping early obedience would mark them as useful, not expendable. The fall of Baghdad had done precisely what Hulagu needed it to do. It rewired the expectations of everyone still standing. The Mongol advance would eventually meet its limit. In 1260, at Ain Jalut in Palestine, a Mongol force was defeated in open battle by the Mamluks of Egypt. A military elite of enslaved soldiers turned rulers who had built their state around professionalized warfare. The Mamluks had studied Mongol tactics. They trained to fight cavalry with cavalry. They drilled archery, feigned retreats, and rapid redeployments. They did not trust in walls alone, or in titles or in divine favor unaccompanied by readiness. They had read the lesson Baghdad provided, and they chose to adapt. Baghdad itself recovered partially in later centuries, especially under new dynasties and later under the Ottomans. People always returned to good river crossings and fertile land, but it never again dominated the Islamic world the way it had under the early Abbasids. The House of Wisdom was not rebuilt. The particular constellation of scholars, texts, and patronage that had once gathered there was gone for good. The manuscripts that fed European science hundreds of years later mostly came through other channels and centers. What did endure was the memory of February 1258. For generations, chroniclers invoked Baghdad's fall whenever they discussed resistance to overwhelming force. Jurists debating the limits of jihad, administrators arguing about tribute, commanders weighing whether to fight or negotiate, all reached back to that moment as a case study. Because the core lesson was not limited to the Mongols or to the 13th century. No amount of inherited prestige will stop a refined military system if you refuse to recognize what you're facing. No sacred title can substitute for logistics, reform, and foresight. Gold that never leaves the vault might as well not exist when the trebuchets start firing. In the clash between institutions that adapt and those that cling to ritual and memory, the outcome is rarely decided by rhetoric. Sometimes all it takes is one catastrophe to redraw the mental map of an entire region. One city burned, one dynasty ended, one ruler wrapped in a carpet and crushed beneath horses. The Mongols did not level Baghdad because they enjoyed pointless destruction. They did it to speak in a language everyone around them would understand. Stone, flame, blood, and silence. The message traveled faster and lasted longer than their armies, and once delivered, it did not have to be spoken again.